By the fifth day, the massive, invisible machinery of my own life had been fully and surgically laid bare to me. I had spent countless agonizing hours sitting in absolute silence in that dim, suffocating motel room, going over every single digit, every thick leather-bound ledger, and every crisp account statement that Mr. Pruitt had meticulously compiled and placed in front of me. I had already confirmed everything he could tell me from the numbers alone. The sprawling house I had built with my own heavily calloused hands, the rolling acres of property it sat on, the heavily guarded investment accounts, the business itself, all of it sat exactly where he said it would. It was completely, utterly, and miraculously untouched by 18 long years of assuming otherwise. I want you to understand something about Mr. Pruitt before we go any further. He was not merely an accountant in the conventional sense of the word, not one of those sterile number pushers you find in glass office buildings wearing expensive suits and cologne that costs more than a week's worth of groceries. Pruitt was a creature entirely of his own making, a paranoid, meticulous, almost fanatically careful man who had survived 3 ears audits in the 90s without so much as a single deduction questioned. I had hired him 12 years ago on the recommendation of a concrete supplier who told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Pruitt was the only man in the county who understood that protecting a man's wealth was not about greed, it was about survival. Pruitt operated out of a converted basement in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town. The walls of his office were lined with steel filing cabinets that looked like they had been salvaged from a decommissioned battleship, each one locked with 3 separate combination locks. He did not trust computers for anything sensitive. Believing that digital files were nothing more than invitations for faceless bureaucrats to rummage through your life from thousands of miles away. Every document he prepared was typed on an ancient M Selectric typewriter, the keys of which clacked with the solemn rhythm of a courthouse clock. The first time I sat in that basement office 12 years ago, Pruitt had looked at me over half-moon reading glasses and delivered a speech I had thought was excessive at the time. The paranoid ramblings of a man who had spent too many years staring at columns of numbers in a windowless room. He told me that marriage, in the eyes of the law, was not a romantic partnership but a financial contract with unlimited liability. He told me that love was the most beautiful and most dangerous thing a man could bring into his financial house, because love made you careless. Love made you sign papers without reading them. Love made you add names to deeds and accounts with the casual ease of sharing a blanket. He had leaned across his desk, close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and told me that if I listened to him, if I followed his instructions to the letter, I would one day thank him for this conversation. I had nodded politely, signed the papers he placed in front of me, and thought to myself that this poor man had clearly been damaged by his profession. I walked out of that basement thinking I was protected by love, that Caroline and I were different, that 18 years of loyalty would be my shield. Sitting in that motel room 5 days ago, staring at the documents Pruitt had compiled, I realized that paranoid old man in the basement had been the only person who truly saw the world for what it was. The numbers in those ledgers told a story I had never fully appreciated until that 5th morning. The house, which I had constructed board by board over 14 months of back-breaking labor, was valued at nearly $800,000 on the current market, though no amount of money could truly capture what that structure represented. Every 2x4 had been carried on my shoulder from the lumber yard. Every nail had been driven by my own hand, every pipe fitted, every wire run, every sheet of drywall hung and mudded until my arms burned with exhaustion. I had worked a full day on other people's construction sites, earning my living, and then driven home to work another 6 or 7 hours on my own house, fueled by black coffee and the vision of the life Caroline and I would build inside those walls. I remembered the winter we framed the second story, working in freezing temperatures until our hands went numb, me and 2 friends from the trade, while Caroline brought us thermoses of hot chocolate and watched from the kitchen window of the rental apartment we were desperate to leave. I remembered the satisfaction of setting the final beam, the way the house had felt alive around us, breathing and settling into the earth. And now, according to Pruitt's documents, the house was owned by a holding company he had established called Northridge Properties, LLC. My name was the only name on the articles of organization. My signature was the only signature on the operating agreement. Caroline's name appeared nowhere in the corporate records, nowhere on the deed, nowhere in any document that gave her legal claim to the structure she had called home for 16 years. The investment accounts told the same story with different numbers. Over 18 years, through careful management and Pruitt's conservative strategies, we had accumulated what most people would consider a substantial nest egg. The accounts were spread across 3 different financial institutions, each one held in my name alone, each one funded exclusively by income derived from my construction business. Pruitt had maintained a spreadsheet tracking every deposit, every withdrawal, every dividend reinvestment with the obsessive precision of a Swiss watchmaker. The business itself, a modest but thriving general contracting operation I had built from a single pickup truck and a toolbox, was incorporated as an S corporation, again with my name as the sole shareholder and director. Caroline had never signed a corporate document, never attended a board meeting, never filed a quarterly tax return. She had been the office manager in the early years, handling phone calls and scheduling from our kitchen table while the business was still small enough to operate from home. But even then, Pruitt had ensured that her involvement was documented as informal assistance rather than official capacity. She had stopped even that minimal involvement after our daughter was born, choosing to focus on being a full-time mother. A decision I had supported completely, never imagining that her absence from the business records would one day form a protective wall around everything I had built. For nearly 2 decades, I had lived under the quiet, comfortable, and ultimately foolish assumption that the life I was building was a shared construct. I believed, as most men do, that it was a joint venture where the foundation was owned by both of us, cemented by trust, shared meals, and whispered promises in the dark. I had spent thousands of days waking up before dawn, pouring concrete, framing walls, and breathing in sawdust, believing that every nail I drove into the wood was securing a future for the 2 of us. But numbers, stark and black against the crisp white paper, do not lie. They do not possess emotions. They do not carry warm memories of wedding anniversaries. They do not remember the holidays or the quiet Sunday mornings, and they certainly do not care about the solemn vows spoken in a crowded church 18 years ago. They only measure reality. And the reality was that the empire I had built belonged solely to me. I had been the architect, the builder, and the sole guardian of a structure Caroline had only ever inhabited. I sat for a long time in that motel room, the paper spread across the cheap particle board desk, thinking about the early days of our marriage. We had been so young, so full of certainty, that love was all the foundation we needed. I remembered our first apartment, a cramped 1-bedroom over a bakery on Main Street, where the smell of fresh bread woke us every morning at 4 o'clock, whether we wanted to or not. We had been happy there, genuinely happy, scraping by on my apprentice wages while Caroline worked part-time at a clothing boutique downtown. We would walk to the diner on Saturday mornings for pancakes we couldn't really afford, holding hands across the table, talking about the future as if it were a destination we were certain to reach together. She had believed in me then, truly believed, in a way that made me feel like I could build anything, move mountains, create a life worthy of the promise in her eyes when she looked at me. When had that belief started to erode? I searched my memory for the turning points, the moments when the foundation had begun to crack beneath the surface while we went about our lives unaware. Was it when the business started to take off and I began working 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week? Was it the year our daughter got sick and I was on a job site 3 hours away, missing the emergency room visit because I couldn't afford to walk away from a project deadline? Was it the gradual accumulation of small absences, forgotten anniversaries, promises to take vacations that never materialized because there was always another job, another deadline, another mortgage payment to earn? I thought about the nights I came home so exhausted I could barely eat the dinner she kept warm for me before falling into bed, too tired to talk, too tired to listen, too tired to be the husband she had married. I thought about the weekends I spent working while she attended our daughter's soccer games alone, the school events I missed, the quiet evenings when she tried to tell me about her day and I nodded along without really hearing her words. I am not telling you these things to excuse what she did. Betrayal is betrayal, and 18 years of loyalty deserved better than secrets and lies. But sitting in that motel room, surrounded by the clinical evidence of my financial protection, I realized that the life I had built was magnificent in its architecture and hollow in its center. I had constructed a fortress of assets and accounts and legal protections, while the actual marriage, the living, breathing relationship between two people, had been left to maintain itself. I had assumed that love, like concrete, would only get stronger with time if you just let it sit undisturbed. I had never thought to check the structural integrity of us. But numbers on a page are not the same thing as knowing what a ruthless, indifferent courtroom will say about them when the heavy oak doors lock and the judge's gavel finally falls. A well-organized spreadsheet can tell you exactly who funded an account, down to the very last cent. It can track the flow of capital over 2 decades with flawless precision. But it cannot guarantee that a judge, bound by the rigid, mechanical nature of marital law, will not arbitrarily order it all split down the middle in the name of equity. I realized very quickly, sitting in the cold, unforgiving light of that 5th morning, that merely being factually right was not going to be enough to survive the coming storm. I needed someone who could tell me not just what was true, but what was legally impenetrable. I needed armor forged in absolute, undeniable legal certainty. I needed a weapon disguised as a contract. So on the 6th day, waking up hours before the sun even considered rising over the horizon, I walked into the dark, silent kitchen. I did not turn on the lights. I made a pot of bitter black coffee, the harsh smell filling the empty room, and sat at the small table, listening to the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. The house around me felt different now. The walls I had painted, the hardwood floors I had laid by hand, the expensive appliances I had bought to make her life easier, they no longer felt like parts of a home. They felt like evidence. They felt like a crime scene, waiting to be documented. I watched the digital clock on the microwave glow a harsh neon green in the darkness, watching the minutes tick by, waiting for the numbers to reach an acceptable hour. Then I picked up the phone and called a lawyer. Her name was Reyes. I had only heard her name once, many years earlier, from an older, broken man I worked with on a massive commercial build on the east side of the city. His divorce had been a spectacular public bloodbath, a catastrophic disaster that had cost him nearly everything he owned because he had hired a lawyer who wanted to be a compassionate friend rather than a clinical assassin. He told me over a warm, flat beer one evening that if the dark day ever came, Reyes was the only one to call. He said she did not waste a single second of your time telling you what you wanted to hear. She did not care about your feelings, and she certainly did not hold your hand while your life fell apart. She just won. I did not know, dialing her office number that cold morning, listening to the phone ring twice before a receptionist with a flat, bored voice answered, that I would end up believing every single word of that assessment. The drive to her office took exactly 3 hours. 3 hours of straight, empty, gray highway. I kept the radio off the entire time. The silence in the cabin of my truck was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. I was gripping the leather steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned a bruised white, my mind relentlessly replaying every conversation, every smile, every casual, effortless lie Caroline had fed me over the last month. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment the rot had started. Was it a year ago? 5 years ago? Had she always been capable of looking me in the eye and smiling while carrying someone else's secrets? I realized on that drive that the betrayal itself wasn't what was consuming me. It was the absolute perfection of her performance. For 18 years, she had played the role of the devoted wife so flawlessly that I had never once thought to check the structural integrity of our marriage. I thought about the man she had become involved with, this person I had never met but had come to know through text messages and phone calls I wasn't meant to see. His name was David. According to the hidden phone I had discovered, a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled through our area regularly. I imagined him as a smoother version of myself, someone who wore dress shirts instead of work boots, who could take her to nice restaurants on weeknights instead of falling asleep on the couch at 8 o'clock. Someone who had time for long conversations and weekend getaways, who didn't come home smelling of sweat and sawdust, whose hands weren't permanently roughened by labor. The thought of them together made something cold settle in my stomach, but I forced myself to think about it anyway, to imagine the scenes that had played out while I was working, while I was earning the money that paid for the house where they met. I needed to feel the full weight of it, to let the anger and the humiliation wash over me until they became manageable, until they hardened into resolve rather than breaking me into pieces. Her office was not located in the gleaming glass and steel towers downtown where the expensive corporate firms sat overlooking the city. It was small, completely unassuming, and tucked away on the second floor above a busy dry cleaner in a gritty industrial part of town I rarely had any reason to visit. The kind of neighborhood where people went when they needed problems solved quietly, not publicly. I parked my truck on the street outside, feeding the meter with quarters I fished from the center console, and stood for a moment looking up at the faded sign above the dry cleaner's entrance. The paint was peeling, the letters barely legible after years of weather and neglect. It was exactly the kind of place you would choose if you wanted your business conducted without anyone noticing, if you wanted to walk in as one person and walk out as someone else entirely. As I walked up the narrow, slightly uneven wooden stairs, the heavy chemical scent of the dry cleaner below permeated the air, mixing with the faint, dusty smell of old paper and stale coffee. There was no polished brass nameplate on the door, no heavy mahogany desk in the lobby, and no imported plush leather chairs meant to intimidate or impress anyone who walked in. There was just a woman in her late 50s, with thick reading glasses pushed up into a messy crown of wiry gray hair, sitting behind a desk that was completely buried under towering precarious stacks of manila folders. It was the kind of desk that meant she actually did the reading herself, line by agonizing line, paragraph by paragraph, instead of handing it off to some junior associate who was fresh out of law school and didn't fundamentally understand the gravity of a ruined life. I walked in and sat down in a plain, uncomfortable wooden chair across from her. I did not know how to start. For 18 years, my entire identity, my entire existence in the world had been deeply tied to being a husband, a loyal provider, a quiet man who built strong things meant to last a lifetime. I had never practiced how to say the specific, destructive words that would dismantle it all in a single afternoon. So, I did not say anything at first. I simply placed my hands on the clasps of my leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic click of the brass locks echoed loudly in the small, quiet room. I opened it and placed the heavy, thick folder on her desk. The deed to the property, the account records, the incorporation documents, Pruitt's meticulous notes from years back, everything that defined my existence on paper. I looked at her, keeping my face entirely blank, locking down every single muscle in my jaw, and told her the short version. It was the exact version I had practiced over and over in my head during the long drive, consciously stripping away all the burning anger, all the visceral, sickening betrayal, so it would not come out sounding like a pathetic confession or a bitter complaint. I needed it to sound like a mundane weather report, just a set of undeniable cold facts delivered by a man who had already accepted the storm was here. My wife has been unfaithful, I said, my voice lower and quieter than I expected it to be in that cramped room. I found out by accident. I have not told her I know. Before I say a single word to her, before I walk back into that house and look her in the eye, I need to understand exactly what I am standing on. I need to know the structural integrity of my own life. Reyes did not react the way I expected, or perhaps the way most people would expect a human being to react to another's profound tragedy. She did not soften her eyes. She did not offer a practiced, condescending sigh of sympathy. And she did not ask me how I was holding up or how I was managing to sleep at night. I was profoundly, deeply grateful for that absolute coldness. If she had asked me how I was feeling, if she had offered even an ounce of pity, I did not trust myself to answer without breaking the fragile, glass-like seal on my composure. I was entirely hollowed out, a walking shell of a man operating entirely on forward momentum and a cold, calculating need for order. She just looked at me for a long, silent moment. Her eyes evaluated me, not as a victim, but as a client. Then she pulled her glasses down from her hair to the bridge of her nose and reached for the thick folder. She opened it, and she started reading, and she did not stop for a very long time. I sat there in the absolute silence of that office for what felt like 20 minutes, though logically it was probably closer to 10. The only sounds in the room were the rhythmic, heavy hissing of the steam press from the dry cleaner downstairs, the relentless ticking of a cheap plastic wall clock, and the crisp rustle of paper as she turned the pages. She would turn a page, read it halfway down, pause, turn back to the previous page, and cross-reference something against a different sheet. I watched her eyes move back and forth behind the thick lenses. I watched the slight furrow in her brow deepen as she waded deeper into the complex financial architecture of my existence. Once, she made a small, sharp sound in the back of her throat, not quite a word, just the subconscious sound a person makes when a puzzle piece snaps violently into a place they did not expect it to fit. When she finally finished, she closed the folder. She aligned the edges of the paper perfectly with her fingertips, making sure everything was perfectly square. Then she looked up and took off her glasses slowly, deliberately, the exact way people do when they are about to say something they want you to hear with crystal clarity. She folded her hands on the desk, resting them on top of my life's work, and told me that, in her decades of experience handling the messy, vindictive, blood-soaked ends of marriages, most people who came into her office believing they were financially protected were completely and utterly wrong. She explained that most people lived under the romantic, fatal delusion that a marriage automatically merged everything in the eyes of the law. They believed that love was the exact same thing as legal ownership. They thought that if you built a life with someone, shared a bed with them for thousands of nights, and paid the utility bills together, the law simply agreed with your heart about how the assets should be divided when the love inevitably died. She said that specific belief was the single most expensive mistake she witnessed, year after year, trial after trial. People build emotional attachments to bricks, to bank accounts, to retirement funds, assuming the court respects the history of a relationship. It does not. And almost always, it was the spouse who actually went to work, the one who managed the household income and carried the heavy, relentless burden of provision rather than the one who carelessly spent it, who ended up paying the catastrophic price for that ignorance. Then she leaned forward slightly, the wooden chair creaking loudly beneath her. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I was the absolute opposite of almost everyone who had ever walked through her door. She said, and I remember this sentence with absolute, terrifying precision, that I had built my house on solid bedrock without ever consciously intending to, simply because I had trusted a paranoid accountant's advice a decade earlier and had never bothered to touch the corporate structure again. Because of the way Pruitt had set up the holding company, the company itself owned the house outright. It wasn't marital property. It was a fortress disguised as a corporate asset. The spending accounts, the massive reserves of cash that had grown silently over the years, were funded entirely at my discretion, shielded heavily behind a labyrinth of legal entities. There was absolutely no legal claim Caroline could make to the source of the funds. My name, and only my name, was on every notarized document, every deed, every title, and every financial instrument that mattered. The funds were locked down tight, entirely secure, bypassing any vulnerable escrow accounts or joint holdings that a divorce judge could freeze, audit, or arbitrarily divide. She explained it to me in terms I could understand, using construction metaphors that made the legal concepts solid and real in my mind. She said most marriages were like houses built on shared foundations, where both names were on the deed and both people had equal claim to every brick. When those marriages ended, the court had no choice but to tear the house down the middle, even if one person had done all the building and the other had simply lived there. But my situation, she said, was different. The house was owned by the company. The company was owned by me. Caroline was not a partner in the company, not a shareholder, not a member of the LLC. She was, in legal terms, an occupant. She had lived in a house owned by my business, enjoyed the benefits of my labor, but she had no ownership stake in the structure itself. Reyes compared it to living in a company apartment or driving a company car. You could use it for years, but you couldn't claim it belonged to you just because you had the keys. I sat there, absorbing the immense, overwhelming weight of what she was saying. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, hard to breathe. I asked her the only question I had driven 3 hours to ask. If I walk into my kitchen tonight, and this marriage ends today, what is the absolute truth of it? She didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She said the truth was simple, and it was incredibly rare. She said most divorce lawyers wait their entire careers to see a case this clean, this legally bulletproof. She told me that if the marriage ended today, Caroline would leave with exactly what she had earned herself during the marriage, which was mathematically nothing, and whatever meager allowance the law protected fairly for a dependent spouse. But she would absolutely not leave with half of a life whose paperwork she had never once bothered to read. She would not get the house. She would not get the accounts. She would not get the business. She would get nothing but a harsh, unyielding reality check. I want to try to explain to you what hearing that sentence did to me, sitting in that dusty, quiet office, listening to the hiss of the steam press below. It did not feel like a victory. I did not smile. I did not clench a fist in triumph, and I did not feel my chest suddenly loosen with a wave of relief. It felt entirely different. It felt like standing on a long, terrifying suspension bridge that you have crossed 1,000 times in the dark, trembling every time the wind blew, only to be told for the very first time that underneath the wooden planks, the entire structure had always been made of solid, unbreakable steel, not fraying rope. You do not celebrate a bridge for being made of steel. You do not cheer for it. You just finally, quietly, stop being afraid of the deep river rushing below you. Rias watched my face carefully, reading the micro-expressions I was trying so desperately to hide. She asked me what I intended to do with this information. I looked down at my hands, the rough, calloused hands that had physically built the walls of the house Caroline was currently sitting in, and I told her the truth. I said I did not know yet. I told her I had not decided whether I was going to drive back, walk straight into the kitchen, and confront Caroline immediately, tearing the roof down in a matter of seconds, or if I was going to wait until I understood the full, ugly shape of the entire situation. Rias offered me a piece of advice that I have thought about every single day since. She said that in her years of watching people destroy each other in courtrooms, the people who acted the fastest were almost always the people who regretted their choices the most. Speed, she said, is just what fear looks like when it is desperately dressed up to look like decisiveness. When you rush to confront someone, when you scream and break things, you give away your absolute power. You give them the opportunity to manipulate the narrative, to cry, to beg, to bring up the past, to make you doubt your own reality. She told me that if I could stand to wait, if I could endure the excruciating psychological torture of sitting across from my wife for even a few more days, I would make infinitely better decisions than the angry, wounded version of me that just wanted to drive home that night and end it screaming in the kitchen. She told me about a client she had represented 2 years earlier, a successful restaurant owner who had discovered his wife's affair and confronted her that same evening. The man had been so consumed by rage that he had thrown a chair through their television, put his fist through a wall, and screamed at her for 3 hours, while their teenage son recorded the entire meltdown on his phone. By morning, the wife had filed for a protective order, claiming she feared for her safety, and the video of his explosion became the centerpiece of her strategy. The restaurant owner lost custody of his children, was forced to move out of his own home, and ended up settling for far more than he should have because his anger had given her all the leverage she needed. Reyes told me this story not to frighten me, but to illustrate a principle she considered absolute. In divorce, the person who keeps their composure keeps their power. The person who explodes gives away both. I told her I intended to gather irrefutable proof of the affair. I didn't want it just to punish Caroline. I didn't care about revenge in the cinematic sense. I wanted it to make absolutely sure that whatever truth came out could not later be rewritten by her, her family, her friends, or a sympathetic judge who might view her as a victim of a cold, distant husband. Rias nodded slowly, a look of genuine respect crossing her weathered face. She told me something that surprised me deeply. She said that in the courtroom, the person who was betrayed was very often the one who ended up being blamed for how they found out, or how they behaved, once they knew the truth. If there is no clear, clinical, undeniable record of what actually happened, people are incredibly quick to defend the version of events that lets them feel less guilty. Caroline would undoubtedly spin a story of a neglected wife, of a man who worked too much, of a minor mistake made out of overwhelming loneliness. Documentation, Reyes said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms, is not an act of cruelty. It is the only thing that keeps a true story true once two people start telling it differently. She recommended a private investigator she had worked with for over a decade. His name was Samuel Okonkwo, though she simply called him Sam. He was a quiet, meticulous, exceptionally careful man who did not take photographs for cheap spectacle or dramatic effect. He took them purely for the permanent record. He understood the delicate legal difference between lawfully gathering evidence and illegally violating a home. Reyes said Sam had testified in over 200 family court cases and had never once had his evidence excluded or his methods questioned. He was expensive, she warned me, but in situations like mine, cheap evidence was worse than no evidence at all. Reyes didn't just give me his number. She picked up her heavy desk phone and made the call herself, right there in front of me. She set up a precise time for him to enter the house while Caroline was out to document the hidden room Marcus had discovered before a single item could be moved, hidden, or explained away. Before I stood up to leave, Reyes looked at me over the rim of her glasses and told me one more thing. It is the thing I remember most clearly out of everything said in that room. She said that almost all of her clients came to her already broken, already screaming, already drowning in tears, completely unable to see past the raw agony of the betrayal to the practical, logistical shape of their own future. They wanted blood, but they didn't know how to survive the bleeding. She said I was the first person in a very long time who had walked into her office already entirely calm, already detached, and she wanted to know why. I stood up, picked up my heavy briefcase, feeling the weight of my reclaimed life inside it, and told her the absolute truth. I said that I had spent 18 years working in a trade where you never ever tear down a load-bearing wall until you know exactly what is behind it. Because if you act on raw emotion, if you swing the heavy sledgehammer just because you are angry, you bring the entire ceiling down on your own head and crush yourself in the rubble. I said I had simply decided to treat the end of my marriage the exact same way I treated a dangerous job site. Assess the structural integrity before you act. She didn't say anything to that. She just picked up her pen and wrote something down on her yellow legal pad, though she did not tell me what it was. Over the following days, the investigator did his work exactly as Reyes had promised. Samuel Okonkwo arrived at my house on a Tuesday afternoon while Caroline was at her weekly yoga class, a predictable 3-hour window that had been part of her routine for years. I wasn't there to see him work, but Reyes forwarded me his preliminary report, and from the meticulous detail of his documentation, I could picture his movements with perfect clarity. He moved like a ghost through the life I had built. He was quiet, methodical, and completely invisible. He entered the house using the master keypad code I had provided, the same code Caroline and I had shared for a decade, and went straight to the room Marcus had found on the second floor, a spare bedroom we had never fully furnished, ostensibly reserved for guests who rarely came. What Marcus had discovered, and what Sam documented with devastating thoroughness, was that this supposedly empty guest room had been transformed into a private sanctuary that told a story Caroline never intended me to read. The closet contained men's clothing that were not mine, dress shirts in sizes I didn't wear, slacks from brands I had never purchased, a blazer hanging in dry cleaning plastic with a tag from a cleaner's across town. The nightstand held a watch, a nice one, silver with a leather band, still ticking, as if its owner had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. The bed was made with sheets I didn't recognize, a higher thread count than anything we used in the master bedroom, with 2 pillows instead of 1, positioned side by side with the intimate symmetry of regular use. Sam photographed every detail from multiple angles, using a measurement scale in each frame to establish spatial relationships and dimensions. He collected fibers from the bedding and hair samples from the bathroom down the hall, evidence that could be tested later if necessary to establish presence and frequency. He documented the 2 expensive robes hanging side by side in the bathroom adjacent to the guest room. He photographed the men's watch resting casually on the nightstand, capturing the brand and the exact time it had been left there. He captured all the intimate, sickening small details that Caroline might have been able to easily explain away individually, but were absolutely impossible to explain away when presented together in a bound, notarized legal document. A single robe might be a gift for a brother who visited occasionally. A watch on a nightstand might belong to a colleague who changed clothes before a golf outing. But robes and watches and men's clothing and 2 pillows used together, documented with timestamps and photographic evidence, created a narrative that no amount of storytelling could unravel. Marcus also gave his account in writing, formally dated and signed under penalty of perjury, describing exactly what he had found, what he had seen, and exactly when he had seen it. Marcus was my apprentice, a 23-year-old kid from the vocational school who had been working with me for 2 years, learning the trade. He had come to the house one Saturday morning to pick up some specialized tools I had promised to lend him for a side project he was working on. Caroline was supposed to be out running errands, but Marcus had arrived early, found the door unlocked, and gone inside to wait. He had heard water running upstairs, thought it was Caroline, and called out to let her know he was there. When no one answered, he went up to check, thinking maybe she hadn't heard him over the shower. What he found instead was the guest room door open, the bed recently used, men's clothing on the floor, and the sound of someone leaving through the back door as he reached the top of the stairs. He never saw the man's face, but he saw enough to know that something was very wrong in a house where I was supposed to be 3 hours away on a job site. Reyes received the encrypted files and locked them down in a secure digital vault, in a way that meant none of it could ever be dismissed as the exaggerated paranoia of a jealous, emotional husband. The chain of custody was documented from the moment Sam entered the house to the moment the files were uploaded to Reyes's secure server. Every photograph was geotagged and timestamped. Every measurement was recorded with precision instruments. Every piece of evidence was collected with the understanding that it might one day be scrutinized by a judge, a jury, or a hostile opposing attorney looking for any weakness to exploit. Reyes told me later that Sam's work was so clean, so beyond reproach, that she could have used it in a criminal case if necessary, which of course it wasn't. But the standard mattered. The standard was everything. While this heavy, destructive machinery was quietly grinding in the background, preparing to level my world, I continued my evening phone calls with Caroline as if absolutely nothing had changed in the universe. I want to be brutally honest with you. This was the hardest part of the entire 10 days. It was significantly harder than the heart-stopping moment I first unlocked that hidden phone and learned the truth. Hearing her voice through the receiver, sounding so warm, so familiar, so casually affectionate as she asked about my day, knowing exactly what she had been doing an hour before, and knowing exactly what I now carried in a thick folder in a lawyer's office 2 states away. It was psychological torture of the highest order, testing the very limits of my resolve. I had been staying at a motel 40 miles from the job site I was supposedly working on. A generic chain establishment with thin walls and carpet that smelled of industrial cleaner and other people's disappointment. Every evening at 6 o'clock, my phone would ring, and Caroline's name would appear on the screen with the same photograph she had used for years. The two of us at a friend's wedding, her smiling up at me with genuine happiness in her eyes, me looking awkward in a rental tuxedo. I would stare at that picture for a few rings, trying to reconcile the woman in the photograph with the woman I now knew her to be, before pressing the button and raising the phone to my ear. "Hey, honey," she would say, her voice warm and effortless. "How was the job site? Did you get the Henderson Foundation poured today?" And I would answer, my voice steady and normal, discussing concrete forms and rebar schedules and weather delays as if I were actually standing in the mud of a construction site instead of sitting on a stiff motel bed surrounded by legal documents and private investigator reports. I would ask about her day, listening to her describe grocery shopping and lunch with friends and the new recipe she was trying for dinner. All the mundane details of a life that looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but was now fundamentally, irreversibly different. Some nights, sitting in the absolute dark of my cheap motel room, watching the red light of the television blink on and off in the pitch black, listening to her complain about a minor issue with her car or a neighbor's loud dog, I almost told her. The words were right there, resting heavy on the tip of my tongue. It wasn't out of weakness that I almost broke my silence. It was out of a strange, stubborn, deeply tragic loyalty to the person I had believed she was for 18 long years. A part of me, a small, dying part of the man I used to be, wanted to give the ghost of my wife a chance to confess, a chance to be honest, just once before the hammer fell. I wanted to believe that if I gave her the opportunity, if I created the right moment, she would break down and tell me everything, explain it somehow, make it make sense in a way that didn't destroy every memory I had of our life together. But I didn't. I swallowed the words, forcing them back down into my chest where they burned like acid. I did not tell her. I have never, for a single second, regretted that agonizing decision to remain silent. But I want you to understand that it cost me a massive piece of my soul to keep it. By the 9th day, the trap was fully set. Everything Reyes needed was assembled, indexed, and ready for deployment. The financial structure was confirmed, audited, and legally documented beyond any shadow of a doubt. The affair was documented lawfully, comprehensively, and undeniably. The truth had been crystallized into a form that could not be argued away by anyone, especially not by Caroline's own memory of events, which I deeply suspected would suddenly soften and alter with time the way memories always do when the truth becomes legally and socially inconvenient. Reyes called me late on the night before I was set to drive home. Her voice was as flat and professional over the phone as it had been the day I met her. She told me the files were complete. I was ready, in her exact words, for whatever conversation I finally chose to have. Before hanging up, she reminded me of one last, critical rule of engagement. She told me that I did not owe Caroline any cruelty, and I certainly did not owe her a dramatic, screaming scene that she could later use against me in court or in public. I only owed her the cold, hard truth, delivered exactly once, clearly and without any hesitation. After that, the rest of the destruction would belong to both of us, strictly in whatever form the law allowed. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and placed it on the cheap laminate nightstand. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress for a long, long time in that silent motel room, 2 states away from the massive house I had built with my own hands. I listened to the faint, distant sound of the highway outside, cars rushing past in the dark, heading toward homes where they believed they were safe. I thought about the absolute absurdity of my life. I realized how incredibly strange it was that the calmest, most grounded, most certain I had felt in 10 agonizing days was in the company of a cynical lawyer I had met exactly twice, going over dry legal paperwork that had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with the truth. I thought about the years of building, the years of believing, and the years of silence. I thought about the way the walls I had constructed seemed to shrink and expand with the weight of the secrets I was now carrying back into that home. The motel room felt like a purgatory, a waiting room between who I was and who I was about to become. The quiet was oppressive, almost heavy enough to crush the breath out of my lungs, but it was a quiet I had chosen. It was a quiet I had engineered. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise. Tomorrow, I would pack my bags, ensuring every document was securely locked away, every detail verified, every bridge burned, and every path forward calculated. Tomorrow, I would get in my truck and drive the long, quiet miles back to the life that was already dead. Tomorrow, I would walk through the front door, feeling the familiar weight of the handle in my hand. I would sit at that expensive dining table one last time, eat a warm meal that Caroline had made with her own hands, a meal seasoned with the ingredients of a house she didn't know she had already lost, and I would look across the table at the woman I had loved for almost 2 decades. And I would tell her, in the exact same even, quiet voice I had used on every ordinary evening call, that I knew everything. The end was not approaching. It had already arrived, and I was finally ready to open the door and let it in. I was the architect of this ruin, and I was the only one who truly understood how it was all going to fall. My work here was finally done. Now, the foundation I had so carefully checked would finally hold, while everything built upon a lie would finally, mercifully, come crashing down into the silent dark. I closed my eyes, took one final, steadying breath, and for the first time in 10 days, I didn't feel the weight of the secrets. I felt only the cold, sharpened edge of the truth, ready to cut through the last remaining threads of a life I had once called home, leaving only the bare, exposed earth of what was rightfully, undeniably, and exclusively mine.